The king auctioned 3 sisters to drunk nobles, until a dark gunslinger stormed the hall. The acrid smoke of burning peat mixed with the stench of spilled mead and unwashed bodies, creating a suffocating fog that hung like a curse over King Eric's great hall. Tonight, something terrible was about to unfold in these stone walls. Something that would change everything. The massive oak beams, blackened by decades of smoke, groaned under the weight of accumulated sin as drunken jarls roared their approval at their king's latest descent into madness. But none of them, not even Eric the Ruthless himself, could foresee the dark figure already riding hard through the Norwegian mountains, drawn by fate toward this very moment of horror. The torches flickered against the stone walls like the eyes of demons, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. In the center of this suffocating chaos stood 3 Saxon sisters, their torn dresses and tear-streaked faces. The youngest, barely 16, clutched a wooden cross to her chest as if it were her last anchor to salvation. She had no idea that salvation might indeed be coming, but in a form none of them could imagine. King Eric slouched on his throne like a broken giant, his once golden hair now streaked with gray and matted with filth. His beard was stained with food and drink, and his bloodshot eyes reflected a grief so profound it had transformed into something monstrous. The death of his son in battle had shattered whatever humanity remained in the old king's heart, leaving only a hollow shell filled with rage and mead. Antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. E me conta nos comentários. De qual cidade você está assistindo? Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. Let the bidding begin. Eric's voice boomed across the hall, slurred but still carrying the authority of absolute power. The jarls erupted in drunken cheers, their faces flushed red with alcohol and twisted by lust. The flickering flames caught their expressions, transforming them into leering gargoyles, hungry for fresh prey. 20 silver pieces for the eldest, shouted Jarl Magnus, raising his drinking horn high. 30 for the middle one, countered another voice from the crowd. But it was when the bidding turned to the youngest sister that the atmosphere grew truly depraved. The girl's knuckles were white as she gripped her cross, her lips moving in silent prayer, while tears streamed down her pale cheeks. The heat in the hall had become unbearable, the air thick with the promise of violence and worse. 50 silver for the little one, roared a bearded giant near the fire. She'll warm my bed through the winter. The other jarls laughed and jeered, making increasingly obscene offers that echoed off the stone walls like the cries of damned souls. King Eric watched it all with those dead, bloodshot eyes, occasionally taking long draughts from his horn of mead, as if trying to drown whatever remained of his conscience. The youngest sister's prayers grew more desperate, her voice barely audible above the raucous laughter. Her 2 older sisters flanked her protectively, but they were powerless against the tide of drunken brutality surrounding them. The bidding war grew more heated, more violent in its language, as the Jarls competed not just for ownership, but for the right to destroy innocence itself. 100 silver pieces, bellowed a voice that silenced the others. The winning bidder stepped forward, his scarred face split by a predatory grin that promised unspeakable horrors. King Eric raised his hand, ready to seal the deal that would damn the three sisters to fates worse than death. The youngest girl's prayers became sobs as she realized her wooden cross would not save her from the hell about to begin. But just as the king's lips parted to speak the final words, crash! The massive oak doors of the great hall exploded inward with such violence that splinters of wood scattered across the stone floor like shrapnel. The deafening sound cut through the drunken revelry like a blade through flesh, instantly silencing every voice in the hall. Even the crackling of the torches seemed to pause in shock. Through the smoke and debris of shattered timber, but dark silhouette emerged from the storm-lashed night beyond. The figure stood framed against the pale moonlight, creating a stark contrast with the hellish glow of the hall's interior. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. King Eric's drinking horn froze halfway to his lips, mead dripping forgotten onto his stained robes. The Jarls, moments before roaring with lustful laughter, now stood frozen like statues carved from ice and fear. The three Saxon sisters looked up through their tears at this mysterious arrival, the youngest still clutching her cross as if it had somehow summoned this dark savior from the night itself. The stranger stepped forward into the flickering torchlight, and the sight that greeted the frozen hall was enough to make hardened warriors question their own eyes. Clad in black leather that seemed to drink in the firelight, the figure moved with a predator's grace that spoke of countless battles survived. But it was the weapons that truly commanded attention, not the traditional axes or swords of a Norse warrior, but strange metal tubes that gleamed with an otherworldly menace at his sides. "Release the girls," the voice cut through the silence, like a blade through bone, carrying an accent that was neither Saxon nor Norse, but something altogether foreign and threatening. King Eric's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he tried to focus on this interruption to his depravity. "Who dares?" he began, but the words died in his throat as the stranger stepped fully into the light. The youngest Saxon sister's grip on her wooden cross tightened as she stared at their potential savior. Hope blooming in her chest like a flower in spring. Her sisters pressed closer, their breathing shallow, as they waited to see if salvation had truly arrived in this hall of horrors. But then the cross began to grow warm in the girl's hands. Not the gentle warmth of comfort, but something else entirely. A heat that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Her eyes widened in confusion as the wooden surface began to change beneath her touch. The carved figure of Christ, writhing and transforming into something that had never known. "I said release them," he repeated, his hands moving to rest on those strange weapons. "You're in no position to make demands, stranger," Eirik snarled, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is my hall, and these slaves are mine too." "Bjorn." The single word fell from the youngest sister's lips like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the entire hall. Every head turned toward her, but she was staring at the dark gunslinger with recognition dawning in her tear-filled eyes. The stranger, Bjorn, went completely still. The predatory confidence that had radiated from him moments before flickered like a candle in a sudden wind. His weathered face, scarred by battles and hardship, registered something that might have been surprise or horror. Astrid? The name escaped his lips as barely more than a whisper, carrying with it the weight of years and secrets and pain. King Eric's drunken confusion gave way to something resembling understanding, though the pieces of this puzzle made no sense to him. "You know this whelp?" But Bjorn wasn't listening to the king anymore. His entire focus was locked on the girl he had once called sister, the girl he had believed dead for 7 long years, the girl whose village he had helped burn to the ground on that terrible night when he still served a different master. Astrid's wooden cross had grown so hot it was beginning to scorch her palms, but she seemed unaware of the pain. The carved figure upon it had completed its transformation, revealing itself to be something far older and darker than Christian faith. The ancient runes carved into its surface began to glow with an unholy light that cast writhing shadows across her innocent face. "I prayed for you to come," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at the brother who had abandoned her to flames and death. "Every night for 7 years, I prayed, and the dark gods, they listened." The implications hit Bjorn like a physical blow. The prophecy, the words spoken by the dying Volva in the burning temple. When the lost child calls to darkness, the betrayer's blood will seal the way. He had thought it mere ravings of a dying woman, but now the transformed cross in Astrid's hands pulsed with malevolent energy, and every candle and torch in the hall flickered in response. The very air seemed to thicken with an empty presence that had nothing to do with smoke or heat. Something ancient was stirring, something that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment of reunion and recognition. King Eric's Jarls began to back away from the sisters, their drunken bravado evaporating as they sensed powers beyond their understanding at work. But there was nowhere to run. The shattered doors had somehow sealed themselves, trapping everyone inside with whatever darkness was about to be unleashed. Bjorn's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but froze as the transformed cross in Astrid's grip began to levitate, its dark runes casting writhing shadows across her tear-stained face. The ancient symbols pulsed with malevolent energy, and suddenly the air itself seemed to scream with voices from beyond the grave. 7 years 7 years I clutched this cross, thinking it would bring me salvation. But the old gods, they had different plans. The wooden artifact spun faster now, its transformed surface revealing intricate carvings that predated Christianity by centuries. King Eric's Jarls pressed themselves against the stone walls, their faces pale with terror as the temperature in the hall plummeted despite the roaring fires. Astrid, What have you done? Bjorn's voice cracked like breaking ice. A smile spread across the girl's lips, but it wasn't her smile. Something else was peering out through her eyes now. Something ancient and hungry. The Volva you killed that night, she didn't curse you, brother. She blessed me. The memories hit Bjorn like a war hammer to the chest. The burning temple. The dying prophecy woman clutching a wooden cross as the flames consumed her. But he had assumed it was some stolen Christian relic. He never looked closer, never saw the runes hidden beneath the crude carving of Christ. She gave me this, Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger as shadows began to coalesce around her sisters. The binding cross of Loki. And she whispered the truth before she died, that you would come for me when the time was right, when I had suffered enough to forge the perfect vessel for the Lie-smith's return. The other two Saxon sisters were changing now, their tear-streaked faces elongating as their forms began to shift and writhe. They weren't sisters at all. They were shadows, fragments of something far more terrible taking shape in the flickering torchlight. King Eric stumbled backward from his throne, mead spilling from his nerveless fingers. What witchcraft is this? But it was Jarl Magnus who provided the answer, his voice barely a whisper. The Ragnarok deception. Sweet Odin's ravens, we've been tricked. Bjorn's blood turned to ice water in his veins as understanding crashed over him. The raid on the Northumbrian village. The three captured sisters brought specifically to this hall, to this night when his guilt would drive him to attempt their rescue. All of it orchestrated across 7 years of careful planning. There never was an auction, he breathed, his gunfighter's instincts finally recognizing the elaborate trap. This was all a summoning ritual, Astrid finished, rising into the air as power coursed through her small frame. The binding cross spun faster, its dark runes now blazing with hellish light. And you, beloved brother, are the final component. The betrayer's blood, willingly spilled in an act of redemption. The floor beneath Bjorn's feet began to crack and splinter, ancient symbols burning themselves into the stone as forces beyond mortal comprehension gathered their strength. The two shadow sisters opened their mouths and released sounds that belonged in the deepest pits of Niflheim, while King Eric and his jarls cowered against the walls like children hiding from thunder. Bjorn reached for his weapons, but his hands passed through them as if they were smoke. The guns that had never failed him, that had carved his legend across 2 continents, were as useless as twigs against the power now filling the hall. The Lie-smith stirs, Astrid said, her voice now a chorus of darkness. And through me, he will walk the world once more. All I needed was your love, brother, your guilt, your desperate need to save me. The youngest sister he had failed to protect 7 years ago smiled with the face of a god of lies, and Bjorn realized that his greatest act of compassion was about to unleash hell itself upon Midgard. But as the ancient power surged through Astrid's transformed body, and the binding cross blazed with unholy light, something impossible happened. Bjorn began to laugh. Not the broken laughter of a man driven mad by despair, but something far more chilling. The deep rumbling mirth of someone who had been playing a game while everyone else fumbled in the dark. The sound cut through the otherworldly screams and crackling energy, like a blade through silk, instantly silencing even the ancient forces gathering around them. Astrid's eyes widened in confusion, the malevolent presence within her flickering like a candle in sudden wind. "What? Why do you laugh?" Bjorn straightened, his weathered face splitting into a grin that belonged in the deepest circles of hell. "Because, little sister, you're not the only one who's been planning for 7 years. The guns at his sides, the weapons that had seemed to dissolve like smoke moments before, suddenly felt solid and real again in his hands. But now they gleamed with runes of their own, ancient symbols that pulsed with a different kind of power entirely. "The vulva you mentioned?" Bjorn drew both weapons in one fluid motion, their barrels catching the hellish light. "She didn't just give you that cross before she died. She whispered something else. Something about her grandson." The temperature in the hall plummeted further as understanding began to dawn in Astrid's possessed eyes. King Eirik and his Jarls pressed themselves harder against the walls, sensing that whatever horror they had witnessed so far was nothing compared to what was about to unfold. "Impossible," Astrid breathed, the ancient presence within her recoiling as if struck. "You're a wanderer, a gunslinger from the eastern lands," he said. "I am Bjorn Bloodraven," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient bloodlines and forgotten oaths. "Grandson of Sigrid the Farseer, last scion of the Volar bloodline, and you, dear sister, have just done exactly what I needed you to do." The binding cross in Astrid's hands began to shake violently, its dark runes flickering as competing powers warred within its wooden confines. The Shadow Sisters beside her writhed and shrieked as their forms began to destabilize. "7 years ago, I didn't just help burn your village," Bjorn continued, raising his runic weapons. "I orchestrated it. Every death, every flame, every scream, all to drive you to this exact moment of desperate summoning. Because Loki isn't the only god who can be bound, and he isn't the only one who can be freed." King Eric's drinking horn shattered against the stone floor as the realization hit him like a physical blow. The auction, the captive sisters, the convenient timing of the mysterious gunslinger's arrival, none of it had been chance. "The prophecy spoke of betrayer's blood," Bjorn said, his guns now blazing with silvery light that seemed to burn away the darkness itself. "But it never specified whose betrayal would matter most." Astrid's scream of rage and terror shook the very foundations of the hall as she finally understood. She wasn't the architect of this night's horror, she was its sacrifice. And the god stirring to life within her wasn't Loki the Liesmith, but something far older and infinitely more dangerous. "Welcome home, grandfather," Bjorn whispered as he pulled the triggers. The twin gunshots rang out like thunder from the halls of Valhalla itself, their echoes bouncing off stone walls with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. But instead of silver light blazing from the runic weapons, something impossible happened. The bullets curved in midair, drawn like iron filings to a lodestone, and buried themselves deep in Bjorn's own chest. Blood bloomed across his black leat. The guns fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against stone as he dropped to his knees. Above him, Astrid floated serenely, the binding cross spinning faster as her possessed laughter filled the hall. Did you really think it would be that simple? Grandson of Volur? The voice that emerged from her throat was no longer just ancient. It was familiar. Terrifyingly, impossibly familiar. King Eric pressed himself against his throne as recognition dawned like a blood-red sunrise. Sigrid, he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a curse. Sigrid the Farseer. Bjorn's head snapped up, his face draining of what little color remained. Grandmother, you're dead. I watched you burn. You watched this body burn. Astrid's mouth curved into a smile that belonged to someone else entirely. But death is such a fluid concept for those who truly understand the old ways. 7 years I've waited inside this child, riding her pain like a longship through stormy seas. 7 years of patience, while you believed yourself the architect of some grand design. The Shadow Sisters beside her began to take new forms, their writhing darkness coalescing into shapes that made Bjorn's blood turn to ice water. One became a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and knowing eyes, his Aunt Brunhilda, who had died in the plague. The other shifted into the form of his younger sister Helga, her throat bearing the same fatal wound he remembered from that terrible night when rivals had come for their family. The Volur bloodline doesn't end with death, little wolf, Sigrid continued through Astrid's voice, floating down until her feet touched stone. We simply relocate, and you've been such a useful tool in gathering us all together again. Every torch in the hall guttered and died simultaneously, plunging them into darkness save for the hellish glow of the binding cross. But in that supernatural light, Bjorn could see the truth writhing in the shadows around him. This wasn't a summoning to free Loki. It was a family reunion orchestrated by the dead. The raids, the burning villages, the scattered survivors. His voice came out as barely more than a croak. You guided me to them, to find suitable hosts. Such a bright boy, Aunt Brunhilda shade purred, her form flickering between shadow and substance. Though it took you long enough to understand. We needed young bodies, traumatized souls broken enough to let us in. And who better to create such perfect vessels than our own beloved descendant? King Eric's Jarls cowered against the walls as the temperature plummeted further, their breath coming out in visible puffs. But the old king himself sat transfixed, watching this supernatural drama unfold with the fascination of a man who had already accepted his own damnation. But why? Bjorn gasped, pressing his hands against the bleeding wounds in his chest. Why use me? Why not simply? Because the ritual requires willing sacrifice, Sigrid explained with the patience of someone who had planned this moment for years. The blood of our bloodline, spilled in an act of love. You came here tonight thinking to save this child. Instead, you've given us exactly what we needed to anchor ourselves permanently to this world. The binding cross pulsed brighter, and Bjorn felt his life force being drawn toward it, like water down a drain. But it wasn't death approaching, it was something far worse. Around the edges of his vision, he could see more shadows gathering, more of his dead family members, preparing to claim new vessels from among the terrified Jarls. "Welcome to the true prophecy, grandson," Sigrid whispered, as the hall began to fill with the forms of the long-dead Volur. "The one about the night our entire bloodline would return to walk among the living once more." But as the Volur spirits began to solidify around their chosen vessels, the great hall's ancient stones began to crack and bleed. Not blood, something far worse. A thick, black substance seeped from between the mortared joints, carrying with it the stench of 1,000 battlefields and the weight of forgotten oaths. King Eric's throne split down the middle with a sound like breaking bones, and from within its hollow core tumbled dozens of yellowed scrolls, bound in what looked suspiciously like human skin. The parchments scattered across the stone floor, their ancient runes glowing with the same hellish light as the binding cross. "What?" Sigrid's voice faltered as her borrowed eyes fell upon the scattered documents. The possessed form of Astrid wavered in mid-air, the binding cross stuttering in its rotation. Bjorn, still bleeding from his self-inflicted wounds, began to laugh again. But this time, it was different. Not the controlled mirth of a master manipulator, but the broken cackle of a man watching his entire world crumble into ash. "You want to know the real prophecy, grandmother?" he gasped, blood speckling his lips. "The one written by King Eric's own hand?" Every eye in the hall turned to the cowering monarch, who had suddenly gone pale as fresh snow. His hands shook as he looked at the scattered contracts, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like a boy's. "How did you find them? I burned those agreements decades ago." "Did you?" Bjorn's voice carried a terrible knowing. "Or did you hide them in the one place you thought no vulva would ever look, inside the throne of a Christian king?" Aunt Brunhilde's shade flickered toward one of the parchments, her form becoming more solid as she read the ancient Norse runes. What she saw there made her scream, a sound that shattered every remaining piece of glass in the hall. "Eric Bloodbought," she hissed, her voice carrying the fury of the betrayed dead. "You sold us. You sold our entire bloodline to the White Christ's priests." The king's drinking horn rolled across the floor, forgotten, as the truth spilled out like poison from a burst abscess. "The Saxon missionaries, they offered me gold, land, legitimacy with the southern kingdoms. All I had to do was deliver the Volur families to their purification rituals." Sigrid's borrowed face contorted with rage, so profound it seemed to warp the air around her. 30 years ago, the night you came to our village with gifts and wine. The night you said you wanted to honor the old ways. The night you drugged our mead and handed us over to be burned as witches, Brunhilde finished, her shade growing more substantial with every word. But it was Bjorn who delivered the killing blow, his voice barely a whisper. "And the night King Eric, the Ruthless, became grandfather to every single one of us." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The Volur spirits froze in place, their forms wavering between fury and impossible confusion. King Eric, their betrayer, their murderer, their secret blood relative, stared at his scattered contracts with the expression of a man watching his own execution. The Saxon priests didn't just burn our mothers, Bjorn continued, each word falling like a stone into still water. They bred them first, made sure the Volar bloodline would continue, but under their control, under their guidance. The binding cross in Astrid's hands began to smoke and crack, its ancient wood unable to contain the conflicting energies now tearing through the hall. The ritual was collapsing. But something else was taking its place, something far more terrible than a simple summoning of the dead. Every one of us carries the blood of our family's betrayer, Sigrid breathed, her spirit beginning to unravel at the edges. Every spell, every vision, every moment of power. Tainted. King Eirik rose from his broken throne on unsteady legs, and for the first time that night, his eyes were completely sober. The priests told me the children would be different, that they would serve the true God when their time came. But I never thought that we would all find each other, Bjorn finished. That we would come home to grandfather's hall for our family reunion. The cracking, binding cross finally shattered completely, releasing waves of corrupted energy that washed over the cowering Jarls like a tide of liquid darkness. But instead of destroying them, the power began to change them, revealing marks beneath their skin that had been hidden for decades, the same Saxon ritual scars that marked every person in the hall. There were no innocent bystanders here, no random witnesses to this supernatural drama. They were all family, and they were all about to discover what 3 generations of carefully orchestrated bloodline manipulation had been building toward. The Saxon ritual scars began to glow beneath every man's skin like molten iron, revealing the horrific truth that had been hidden for 3 decades. King Eric's Jarls weren't random nobles. They were all his bastard sons, bred from the captured Volar women and raised in ignorance of their true heritage. The Great Hall had become a gathering of an entire cursed bloodline, manipulated across generations into this single moment of cosmic horror. But as the realization struck like lightning, one of the Jarls stepped forward from the shadows. His scarred face caught the hellish light of the dying ritual, and when Bjorn saw him clearly, his shattered heart stopped beating entirely. "Hello, brother." The voice belonged to Ragnar Kinslayer, the man who had murdered their sister Helga 7 years ago. The man Bjorn had hunted across 2 continents. The man he had watched die, choking on his own blood in the ruins of a burned monastery. Yet here he stood, whole and breathing, the ritual scars beneath his skin pulsing with the same corrupted Volar power that flowed through them all. "Impossible," Bjorn gasped, his gunshot wounds forgotten in the face of this new horror. "I killed you. I watched you burn." Ragnar's laugh was like grinding stone. "You killed a shadow, little brother. A spirit double sent to convince you I was gone while the real work continued." He gestured to the possessed form of Astrid, still floating above them, despite the shattered cross. "Did you really think grandmother would trust something this important to chance?" The Volar spirits around the hall began to coalesce more solidly. But instead of taking new hosts, they moved toward Ragnar with reverence. Even Sigrid's ancient presence bowed before him, her borrowed voice filled with terrible pride. "My greatest grandson," she whispered through Astrid's lips, "the one who understood that the old ways required new methods." Bjorn's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The villages he had burned, the families he had scattered, the careful orchestration of trauma and loss. None of it had been his idea. Every thought, every plan, every moment of supposed free will had been guided by Ragnar's whispers in his ear. "The guns," he breathed, looking at his fallen weapons with dawning horror. "The runes on them." "Binding runes," Ragnar confirmed, his scarred face splitting into a predatory grin. "Not to control spirits, but to control you. Every shot you fired, every life you took, every moment you believed yourself the master of your own destiny, all of it fed power back to us. The ritual wasn't collapsing after all. It was transforming." The scattered parchments on the floor began to smoke and writhe, their ancient words reshaping themselves into something far more terrible than contracts of betrayal. King Eric's broken throne started to rebuild itself, but not as it had been, as something that belonged in the deepest halls of hell itself. 30 years of planning, Ragnar continued, his form growing larger and more terrible with each word. 30 years of breeding the perfect bloodline. 30 years of pain and manipulation to create the one thing the old gods truly feared. Astrid's possessed body began to change, her young features aging and shifting, until she wore the face of someone else entirely. Someone whose death had started this entire cycle of vengeance and horror. Their mother, Bjorn whispered, recognition hitting him like a warhammer. Ingrid Truthseer, Ragnar confirmed. The Volva whose murder King Eric ordered personally. The woman whose dying curse set this entire plan in motion. And now, thanks to your willing sacrifice, she has a body young enough and powerful enough to complete her final prophecy. The thing wearing Astrid's form opened eyes that held the accumulated hatred of 3 decades. And when it spoke, its voice carried the authority of the grave itself. "The age of the White Christ ends tonight," it declared, raising hands that crattled with power beyond mortal comprehension. "And the age of the returned Völlr begins." But as the transformation reached its crescendo, Bjorn felt something impossible stirring in his chest. Not pain from his wounds, but warmth. The bullets Ragnar had enchanted to control him were dissolving, their binding magic broken by the very apotheosis they had helped create. For the first time in 7 years, his mind was completely his own. And he finally remembered what his real sister Helga had whispered before Ragnar killed her. The true prophecy that would damn them all. The warmth in Bjorn's chest exploded into blazing agony as Helga's final words echoed through his freed mind. "When the Truthseer returns, ask her why she carved Father's name into my spine." The memory hit him like a berserker's axe to the skull. Helga hadn't been killed by Ragnar at all. She had been sacrificed by their own mother, Ingrid Truthseer, in the original ritual 30 years ago. The scars he thought were torture marks. They were binding runes carved by a mother's hand into her own daughter's flesh. "You remember now," The thing wearing Astrid's body purred, its voice carrying Ingrid's ancient malice. Good. I was growing tired of the charade. Bjorn's blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over him like a frozen wave. The village burning, the Saxon priests, it was all you. You orchestrated your own capture. Such a clever boy, Ingrid cooed through stolen lips. The priests thought they were purifying heathen witches. Instead, they were breeding the perfect bloodline for my return. Every child born from their holy work carried my essence, waiting for the right moment to awaken. King Eric stumbled backward from his reforming throne, his face twisting with horror, as memories long buried clawed their way to the surface. You seduced me first, before the priests came, before I agreed to betray the Volor families. I needed a king's blood to anchor the spell, Ingrid confirmed, her borrowed form growing more terrible with each revelation. What better way than to make you fall in love, to make you believe the betrayal was your own idea? But it was Ragnar who delivered the final crushing blow. She's not just our grandmother's spirit brother. She's our mother, our real mother. The woman who carved binding runes into all our spines while we slept as children. Bjorn's hand flew to his back, his fingers finding raised scars he had always believed came from battle. The ritual marks burned beneath his touch, responding to their creator's presence like iron calling to iron. Every raid you led, every village you burned, every moment of guilt that drove you toward redemption, all of it fed power back to me. Ingrid laughed, her voice splitting the air like cracking ice. My children, dutifully gathering the vessels I needed for my final return. The Volor spirits around the hall weren't ancestors at all. They were fragments of Ingrid herself, scattered pieces of a consciousness too vast for any single mortal form to contain. And now, with Astrid's young body as an anchor, and the combined blood of her offspring as fuel, she was finally whole again. But as the terrible truth settled over the hall, like a burial shroud, Astrid's voice, her real voice, whispered from somewhere deep within the possessed form. The cross, it wasn't binding Loki, it was binding her. And when you shot yourself, you broke it. Bjorn's eyes widened in horror as he realized the final crushing irony. His act of self-sacrifice hadn't been manipulated. It had been the one genuine choice in 30 years of orchestrated horror. And that choice had just freed the most dangerous vulva who ever lived. Ingrid's laughter shook the reconstructed throne, but beneath it, something else stirred. The scattered parchments on the floor weren't just contracts. They were containment spells, written in King Eirik's blood and powered by his guilt. Spells that had been holding something far worse than a vengeful witch mother in check. "Thank you, my darling son," Ingrid whispered as cracks began spreading across the stones beneath their feet. "You've just awakened the devourer of worlds." The ancient stones cracked wider as something far beneath the hall began to stir. Something that had been sleeping since the world was young. But as the primordial darkness clawed its way toward the surface, King Eric did something that froze every soul in that cursed place. He began to laugh, not the broken cackle of a man driven mad by revelations, but the deep, satisfied chuckle of someone whose greatest gamble had finally paid off. The old king straightened from his cowering posture, his bloodshot eyes clearing as 3 decades of carefully maintained deception fell away like shed snakeskin. "Ingrid Truthseer," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier drunken slur. "Most powerful vulva of the age. Mother of monsters, devourer of the innocent." His smile was sharp as a blade. "And the most gullible woman I ever met." The possessed form of Astrid wavered in midair, Ingrid's ancient consciousness recoiling as if struck. Around the hall, her scattered spirit fragments flickered with sudden uncertainty. "Impossible," she hissed through stolen lips. "I controlled everything, every move, every choice." "Every choice I allowed you to believe you controlled," Eric interrupted, reaching into the ruin of his throne to withdraw a single scroll that glowed with runes far older than any Völler magic. "Did you really think a king could survive 30 years of dealing with witches without learning a few tricks?" Bjorn felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized the symbols crawling across the parchment. Not Norse runes at all, but something that predated human civilization entirely. Something that belonged to the things that had ruled before the gods themselves were born. "The Saxon priests weren't my allies," Eric continued, his entire bearing transformed from drunken fool to master manipulator. "They were my puppets, just like you, dear Ingrid, just like your precious bloodline." The temperature in the hall plummeted as understanding crashed over the vulva's consciousness like an avalanche. "The contracts, the binding spells, weren't meant to contain your power," Eric finished. "They were meant to amplify it, to feed it, to make you strong enough for what's coming next." Ragnar stepped forward, his scarred face twisting with fury. "What are you talking about, old man?" But it was Astrid's voice, her true voice, that answered from within her possessed form, weak but filled with dawning horror. "The cross, it wasn't just binding Loki or her. Look at the runes. They're not Norse." Bjorn's vision blurred as he stared at the symbols etched into the hall's stones. Finally, seeing them clearly, they weren't containment spells or binding rituals. They were summoning circles, feeding circles. Everything that had happened tonight, every drop of spilled blood, every moment of supernatural power, every revelation and betrayal, had been pouring energy into something vast and hungry, waiting in the spaces between worlds. 30 years I fed it, Eirik said, with the pride of a craftsman unveiling his masterwork. 30 years of carefully orchestrated pain and magical discharge. The Völler bloodline was never the goal, Ingrid. It was the bait. The ancient presence stirring beneath the hall was fully awake now, and it was nothing human, nothing that had ever been human. The cracks in the stone floor widened as something immense began pushing its way through from whatever hellish dimension had spawned it. "You see," King Eric continued, as reality itself began to warp around them, "there are things older than your precious old gods. Things that were ancient when Odin was just a whisper in the void. And they've been very patient, very hungry." Ingrid's scream of rage and terror shattered what remained of the hall's windows. But her cry was answered by something far worse, a sound from below that made every mortal throat in the room close in primal terror. The devourer of worlds wasn't some metaphor or legend. It was King Eric's true master, and it was coming home. But as the ancient entity clawed its way through reality's fabric, something impossible happened. The youngest voice in that hall of horrors, Astrid's true voice, began to sing. Not the dark incantations of Volur magic or the hymns of Christian faith, but something far older. A lullaby her real mother had sung before the world went mad, passed down through generations of ordinary people who had never wielded power or commanded spirits, but who had loved their children enough to remember simple songs in the darkness. The primordial entity's ascent faltered. King Eric's confident smile cracked as the ancient runes on his scroll began to smoke and curl around the hall. The Volur spirits flickered like candles in sudden wind, their borrowed power wavering against something they had never encountered before. Pure, untainted human will. Bjorn felt strength flowing back into his wounded body. Not magical power, but the simple, stubborn refusal of mortal flesh to surrender. He reached for his fallen guns, their runic bindings dissolving like morning frost. But instead of firing at Ingrid or Eirik, or the crawling horror beneath the stones, he turned the weapons on himself once more. "Blood calls to blood," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But love calls louder." This time, when the bullets took him, they carried with them every drop of Volur blood in his veins, and every connection that blood had forged to the supernatural forces tearing the world apart. The binding chains linking mother to son, king to pawn, ancient evil to its earthbound anchors, all severed in one final act of willing sacrifice. Ingrid's scream of fury became a wail of loss as her power scattered like leaves in a hurricane. The entity below howled as its carefully prepared feast dissolved into nothing. King Eirik's scroll crumbled to ash as 3 decades of meticulous planning collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. But Astrid kept singing, her voice growing stronger as the supernatural forces died around her. And in that simple melody, Ragnar found something he had lost decades ago. The memory of being human. The scarred warrior knelt beside his dying brother, his hands shaking as he pressed them against wounds that were already beyond healing. "I remember now," he whispered. "I remember who we used to be." Bjorn's eyes found his brother's face, seeing past the scars and madness to the frightened boy who had once shared his bed during thunderstorms. "The village by the fjord," he breathed. "Mother's real grave. Take her there." Around them, the hall began to collapse as the supernatural forces holding it together dissipated. King Eirik aged 30 years in 30 seconds, his borrowed vitality fleeing with his demonic master. The Volur spirits faded like smoke, no longer anchored to the world of the living. Even the stones themselves seemed to sigh with relief as ancient curses finally lifted. Years later, travelers would find 3 graves on a hill overlooking a peaceful Norwegian fjord. The largest stone bore no name, only the image of a pair of crossed guns beneath a simple wooden cross. The smallest was covered in wildflowers that bloomed year-round, tended by an old woman who claimed they were for a sister she had never met but always loved. And the middle grave, worn smooth by countless hands, bore an inscription in runes that every Volar descendant could read, but none would dare speak aloud. Here lies one who chose love over power, redemption over revenge, and silence over the songs of the dead. The wind through the fjord still carries echoes of that final lullaby, reminding all who hear it that even in the darkest halls of human ambition, a simple voice, raised in love, can shatter chains that have bound the world for generations. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Scalde. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.